Chapter 8, Real Estate Sales Contract. The purpose of a sales contract is to allow time to ascertain that the parties can each perform the terms of the agreement which are written and sign promises to perform. Hence, during this time period, various items can be taken care of, such as we can determine if the seller actually holds marketable title. It also allows time for the buyer to arrange the necessary financing for the transaction, and it also allows time to have the title examined, as well as various other items and details that can be taken care of. Let's first look at purchase contracts for real estate. A purchase contract contains 4 key parts. 1 is provision for the buyer's earnest money deposit, the buyer's offer to purchase the property, the acceptance of the offer by the seller, and provisions for the payment of a brokerage commission. Let's look in more detail at each one of these. So first, the earnest money deposit. What is it? Earnest money is money that accompanies an offer to purchase. It shows a buyer's good faith in the transaction. No law governs the amount of this earnest money deposit. Hence, only buyers and sellers determine amongst themselves what the earnest money deposit should be. Earnest money is not consideration. Even though a purchase contract is a legal contract, in an earlier chapter we learned that there were various contract essentials for the contract to be valid. As a reminder, those included parties to the contract had to be competent, there had to be mutual agreement, the contract governed a lawful objective, there was consideration, and when required, the contract had to be in writing. And for the purchase and sale of real estate, we know that that must be in writing. However, earnest money is not consideration. Hence, it is not required for a valid contract. The earnest money deposit is paid upon the signing of a contract of sale by the offeror, and it could serve as liquidated damages if the buyer defaults. Let's look at some contract terms, including deed and condition of title. The contract will make mention to what type of deed and condition of title the buyer is willing to accept. In terms of a closing agent, some states use what's called an escrow agent to handle the closing of the transaction. An escrow agent or a closing agent, their responsibility or their duties include the acceptance of the deposits of consideration, legal documents to this neutral third party, the escrow agent. And those documents and money are held until conditions of the contract are performed. Hence, the two parties, the buyer and seller, need not be present at closing when using a closing agent or an escrow agent. The contract, the purchase agreement, sales agreement, will also discuss prorating. there are going to be certain prepaid expenses and expense accruals that need to be divided up between the buyer and the seller. That will occur at closing. Inspections. The sales contract will also mention various inspections. The most important of these is the termite inspection to determine whether or not the property is free from termites and rotten wood. The seller will provide this report. If there is some sort of termite damage, the seller is responsible for making those renovations, to making those sorts of, or they're responsible for paying for those damages. Possession. Possession regards the date which the property will be turned over to the new owner. That usually occurs at closing. However, what if the buyer wants to take possession before closing? This can be handled by structuring a rental agreement for that time period before the buyer would actually take title to the property. Loan conditions. Offers on a property by a buyer are usually made subject to obtaining a loan under certain terms and conditions. For a buyer to obtain a loan and arrange his financing, this is usually the most time-consuming part of the sales process. So oftentimes, a buyer will make an offer subject to obtaining a loan. If that buyer cannot arrange that financing, then the offer is voidable by the buyer. In other words, the potential buyer has the right to withdraw from the transaction without forfeiting his or her deposit. Some additional conditions could include something like, would personal property be involved in this transaction? If that's the case, we would not need an additional bill of sale. It would not be necessary. We can go ahead and bundle in any personal property in the sales contract, and then it would be conveyed along with the real property. But it would have to be, that personal property would have to be listed in the sales contract. What happens if there's property damage between the date of this contract and the actual closing of the transaction? There'll usually be made some mention in the sales contract as to how the buyer can free himself from the transaction should that occur, if any property damage occurs between the date of the sales contract and the closing of the transaction. What if we have a buyer that gets cold feet and defaults on his end of the bargain? Some of the standard choices for buyer default is that the seller can just release the buyer and return his or her deposit. The seller can sue for specific performance, or the seller can sue for money damages. On the other hand, what happens if the seller defaults and pulls his or her property from the market after a bargain has been struck? If the seller defaults, well then the buyer can recover his or her earnest money plus any expenses incurred up to that point in time. He or she could sue for specific performance or sue for money damages. In terms of time limits on offers, here we get to phrase that's often used in legal contracts. That is, time is of the essence. That's a legal term which means the time limit set by the contract must be faithfully observed or the contract is voidable by the non-defaulting party. Due to the legal nature of this term, it should never be used by the real estate agent. Let's move on to some additional contract terms. The signatures. When a buyer makes an offer, obviously he is going to sign it. He immediately gets a copy of that offer, and the rest of the copies go to the seller. When the seller accepts the offer, he or she will sign, and again, the buyer gets the first copy. But what if the seller rejects that offer? Rejection of only a small part of the offer is a rejection of the entire offer. And hence, this is when we get into a counteroffer, a subject that we talked about in a previous chapter. The counteroffer then goes back to the buyer. Should the buyer accept it, at that point, it's only then that we have that mutual agreement. Notification. Well, again, the buyer always receives the first copy, whether it's when he makes the offer or when an offer is accepted. All the buyer signed always receives that first copy. There are certain federal clauses that are included in sales contracts. One has to do with properties that are financed with FHA and VA loans. If the price of the property is not equal to its appraised value, in other words, if the price is greater than the appraised value of the property, there is a clause, a federal clause for FHA and VA loans that allows the borrower to get out of this contract without any sort of repercussion. Another federal clause has to do with insulation disclosures. For new homes, there has to be a disclosure in sales contracts as to the type, the thickness, the R value of insulation in new homes. There also, for older homes, there would be a disclosure related to lead paint. And we'll look at that a little bit more closely in our next slide. Some contracts have these pre-printed clauses, especially if it involves the purchase or sale of a condominium or if a property is in a flood zone. Some contracts have riders, also known as addendums or attachments. This is any addition annexed to a document and made part of the document. We can also discuss briefly about the negotiation that goes on between the buyer and the seller. We're talking about one parcel of real estate. The buyer would like to pay the lowest price possible for that property, but the seller or the owner of the same property wants the highest price possible. Hence, there's a conflict between these two parties. So as I mentioned previously, in older homes, They often contain paint that was lead-based, and the presence of lead-based paint is very hazardous, especially to young children. And 3/4 of the nation's housing built before 1978 probably contains some lead-based paint. Federal law requires that before a buyer or tenant becomes obligated under a contract for sale or even lease, the seller or landlord must disclose this possibility of lead-based paint and the hazards that go along with it by providing the potential buyer or potential tenant with this pamphlet called Protect Your Family from Lead in Your. Other types of real estate sales contracts include the binder. That's a short purchase contract used to secure a real estate transaction. That is, in other words, it binds together a buyer and seller until a more formal contract can be signed. In other words, this is probably going to be a very detailed and complex sales contract that is going to have to be drafted by an attorney. But while that's taking place, a binder will hold together, will secure that transaction, will bind together the buyer and the seller until the more formal contract can be signed. A letter of intent, on the other hand, is not a sales contract. A letter of intent is used to express the mutual intention buy, sell, lease, develop, or invest in a property. It only outlines the agreement of the terms, and there is absolutely no obligation created via a letter of intent. It is not a contract, but a binder is. Most sales contracts, or especially for residential, single-family residential homes, they're pre-printed forms, and a real estate salesperson or broker can fill in the blanks on that pre-printed form. Unfortunately, if a pre-printed form requires extensive cross-outs, changes, riders, then a real estate broker or salesperson does not have the knowledge or they don't have the authority to do that. So if they can fill out a pre-printed form, they can fill in the blanks. However, if there are extensive changes to that pre-printed form, that contract should be drafted by an attorney. Because if they make too many changes to a pre-printed form, that means that that broker or salesperson is attempting to practice law. And a real estate license is not a license to practice law. They can't do it, and they can't charge. Some other types of sales contracts that one might come into contact with regarding real estate includes the installment contract. This is when the seller retains title, but the buyer takes possession and the buyer makes payments directly to the seller rather than to a lender, to an outside third-party lender. The buyer doesn't take title until all those payments are made to the seller. So in effect, we have seller financing of the transaction. An option contract occurs when a party pays a fee for the right to buy a certain property at a certain price during a certain time period. So a potential buyer may make a payment for an option, giving them the right to buy the property during a certain time period at a certain price. So during that time period, they can exercise that option. However, they can also let the option expire and not buy the property. In either case, the potential buyer still pays a fee for that option for the right to buy the property. A lease with an option to buy allows a tenant to buy a property at a certain price during a certain time. The difference here between the option and the lease with the option to buy is that with just the plain option, there is no lease. The owner is not acting as a landlord for the potential buyer. But with a lease with an option to buy, here the tenant is leasing and has an option to buy the property. Of course, he doesn't have to. He doesn't have to exercise that option. The right of first refusal gives a party the right to match or better an offer. We can also have exchange agreements where we have the sale of a property in exchange for another. And the reason that exists is that it affects a non-taxable gain. And here is some possible trading combinations that would affect a non-taxable. Remember that the job of the real estate agent is to determine the business details of the transaction and not to practice law. In other words, they cannot draw up an original sales contract. They can fill in the blank on some pre-printed contracts, but that's about it. Can't make any major changes to that pre-printed form. In Chapter 8, we have an example of a sales agreement or a purchase agreement. That is a pre-printed form. Real estate agent can fill that in, but once he makes too many changes to that pre-printed form, he gets into some murky waters, practicing law, and that's against the law. So a real estate license is not a license to practice. Here are some key terms from Chapter 8. Questions? Don't hesitate to ask.